out here and join us this evening. I know that there are other things that are going on, so I'm going to get through this as quickly as possible, but I'm also not going to rush anybody at all. So at any time, any point you want to stop, ask questions, clarify, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you have about any of this. And so before this begins and before I even start clicking through it, I want to kind of explain a couple of things on how this works. Please, as you come and grab a clicker, there's clickers right in front of you there. Any one of them will work just fine. The purpose of this survey is for me to gather input from you all and get a good sense of what programs are held sacred, what areas that the community feels reductions could be absorbed, and also get some data on thoughts on restructuring, programming, et cetera, et cetera. The rumors that have been rampant on social media, they are what they are, and ever since the day one that I started this presentation, this is the seventh one I believe that I've given now, I've heard everything from, you're closing Fairhaven to Millside to Elginak to combining, et cetera, et cetera. There are pieces of all of these in the presentation, but I want to preface it with this. These are simply just ideas. That's all that these are. You're going to see 26 ideas that are presented to you, and you're going to have a chance to vote on these ideas, and it ranks all the way from I'm strongly in favor of this idea to the very bottom, which is I strongly disagree and never even mention this again. And so the purpose of it is gathering data from all factions that I possibly can. Again, this is, I think, the seventh presentation that I've given. And one thing that I found is that opinions drastically vary by groups that you talk to. The elementary parents have spoken very differently than have some high school parents, and have spoken very differently than even the Elginak Rotary that I did the presentation to as well. So when this is all done, all the results will be aggregated together, and we're going to use those results to help drive us in the decisions that we're making to be able to get through the budget situation that we're in. So with that, I'm going to start with a preface and give you some ballpark numbers of where we are, where we're going, and what we have to do, and why we have to have this difficult conversation. In October, the audit that was done by the Plant Ryan was approved by the Board of Education, and the audit that came through showed that last year we spent $1.12 million of our fund equity. And for those of you that don't know what fund equity is basically our piggy bank. And so in our savings account, in our piggy bank, we have approximately $2.72 million of fund equity remaining. And that number puts us around 15% of our budget, which if you are to go out there and research schools, there's a lot of schools that are awful jealous of a 15% fund equity. 15% is considered to be healthy. And so right now we're sitting in a spot that really isn't all that bad. So when you look at 15% fund equity and say, why are we having this talk? Well, you have to look at future numbers and where they're coming from. So the future numbers look like this. We have a projected budget deficit this year of $1.46 million. And so it's our goal throughout this year to reduce that budget deficit down as much as we humanly possibly can. In March, we'll be doing our first budget amendment, which will take this number, look at the first performance of the first 2/3 of the year and try and break this number down. We've seen some preliminary numbers on this, and it's not as pretty as I really wanted it to look. Right now, our first budget amendment probably is going to put us somewhere in the $1.3 million range. We had another drop in enrollment that we weren't anticipating that kind of affected us negatively and didn't put us a farther drop than we are. And so taking these numbers into account, we have $2.72 million in our fund equity, in our piggy bank, savings account, whatever you want to call it. We have a projected deficit of 1.4, let's call it 1.3. If you take the 2.7 to 1.3, we are estimating that we're going to approximately have $1.26 million in our fund equity remaining at the end of the year. And again, this number can fluctuate up and down based on how good we do in our savings throughout the year. That puts us at about 8.5%. And so now you can kind of see in your head that if we had a $1.46 million structural deficit this year, and at the end of the year we have $1.26 million left in our account, if we make no changes, then we are not going to have money. We're going to be out. We're going to be actually in the hole $200,000. And so we know that we need to maintain a fund equity somewhere in the neighborhood of 6.5 or 6 to 7.5%, and we need to do this for a couple of reasons. One, we need to maintain cash flow so we can make payroll during those lean months. Schools that cannot maintain a certain cash flow number have to borrow money to make payroll. And you all know from your own budgets, when you're borrowing money to pay money, then you're simply complicating your issue as well too. So we know that we need to maintain cash flow. And I really want to put a personal touch on this as well too. We make no changes if we project ourselves of being out and having to borrow. You have to self-report yourself to the state of Michigan as what they call a deficit district. And a deficit district is put on something called a DEP. And a DEP to me is the absolute scariest thing that can happen to a school district in our times right now. And the reason I call it scary is because when this happens, you then lose degrees of local control. You have to submit your elimination plan to the state, and the state gets to look at that elimination plan and say, yes, no, maybe so, we think you should go here, you need to do this and that. I really, truly do not think that Lansing knows what's best for the Algonac Community Schools. I think that the Algonac Community Schools and our constituents and our stakeholders and our voters know what's best for the Algonac Community Schools. And again, when you get yourself in that position where you're on a DEP, you lose those controls. Now, we are not alone in this, and I want to point out a couple of districts that are in much worse situations than ours. I just talked about a DEP and what a deficit elimination plan is. Right now, there's approximately 50 districts in the state of Michigan that are on deficit elimination plans, and I'm going to show you a couple extreme examples from schools that you may not even think were in these kind of financial situations. I'll point out one for you, in the Brighton area schools. Brighton area schools, if you know about them, they have a pretty solid reputation, strong academic programs, state award-winning athletic programs, band and art programs. When you see brackets means negative. And so if you just take the June 2013 line, scroll down and take a look here, they have a negative $8.5 million balance. And so what that means in real terms is they have no piggy bank. It's out, it's zero, and they're borrowing $8.5 million per year to make it. And if you go down this column and look at some of the other districts, Benton Harbor, 15 million, Flint, 10 million, 8.5 for Brighton, 5 million for East Detroit, 3 million for Clintondale, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're interested in these numbers, all you have to do is go to Google, type in Michigan deficit school districts, and this entire list will come up there for you. These districts are on deficit elimination plans, and if they don't meet the terms of those plans, that's when you start seeing the extremes. Schools that you've heard in the news, Buena Vista last year, Inkster last year. Right now, if you're paying attention to it, Saginaw is going through it right now. And when these schools don't meet the terms of their plans, the state will withhold payments. They can't pay their teachers, you get walkouts, you get closures, et cetera, et cetera. So are we on this list? No. But if we do nothing, we will end up on this list, and we will be into a degree of a deficit elimination plan. And again, one, we have to maintain cash flow. Two, we have to make sure that we're remaining fiscally viable so we are not ending up in a situation where the state is telling us where we have to expend our finances. And so with that, I'm going to give you a bit of a history, a 5-year window. I'll talk about a few things that go further back in those 5 years. We'll start at 2008 and 9, where our revenues were an actual $17.6 million. And this year we projected our revenue is going to be $16.2 million. Our expenditures back in 08 and 9 were $17.17 million, and 13-14 they're projected now $17.46 million. Our enrollment has decreased over time. We had anticipated that this year really would have been the stabilization point. We'd seen really kind of a steep decline in our enrollment. We had leveled out for the past 2 years. We've been almost par, and then this year we saw another decrease of about 30 students that we hadn't anticipated. So our enrollment we thought was near the bottom, but really is starting to see another dip. And again, for those of you that understand school finance know that each student really is roughly about $7,026 for the district. So every student that isn't in the district costs us a large sum of money. From 08-9 to current, we have had a reduction in staff, and you can see the numbers there. Administrators have gone down from 12 to 9. Teachers' counselor speech from 123 to 107. Secretaries, aides, et cetera, 44 to 29. I don't have to read them all for you. But you can see staff levels in 08-9 compared to where we are now are also drastically reduced as well too. A couple of slides here on things that the district has done over the past 5 years in order to be able to reduce our deficit. Reduction of one elementary school, but actually we know that that's 2. If you go back even further, it started with the Island School, and then we know it was Point Trumbull Elementary as well too. We know that we privatized busing last year. Steps at the semester have been frozen, steps and lanes, and if you don't understand what that means, teachers every single year that they accrue up to about 12, they get a pay raise each and every single one of those steps. The past 2 contracts have included freezes where those steps don't occur for teachers. And a lane change is where a teacher attains a higher degree, where the degree goes from a bachelor's to a master's. That puts you in a different lane of salary. That's been frozen as well too for the past 2 contracts that have gone through. The state has helped us out a bit when it comes to being able to negotiate, not take away health insurance negotiations from us. We don't have to negotiate levels of health insurance anymore because we have the ability to implement either an 80-20% split between employees and employer, or also do cap levels as well too. We've reduced assistance programs, the reward program. We've done smaller things like reduce the number of reporters that we publish. Our accident insurance has been eliminated. Our timekeeping, we've reduced the method in which we do that to save expenses. Administrators have taken concessions. Furlough days for the past 3 years consecutively. It was 5 3 years back, 3 2 years back, 5 before again, and that's where we're at currently. Life insurance benefits were reduced for administrators. Tuition reimbursement was cut out of the contract. Building supply budgets have been reduced. Schedule B positions and salaries have been reduced. For those of you that don't know what Schedule B is, that's our extracurriculars. Our Schedule B is our coaches. That's also the people that do our class advising, student council, et cetera, et cetera. Reduced our textbook curriculum budget. We created athletic fees. We reduced our professional memberships. And also in the summer, we do 4-day work weeks to try and conserve power and energy. Okay? And so, over the past years, a lot of proactive measures have been taken. But we are at a point now where the amount that we're dipping into our fund equity has got to stop. We have to make structural changes so that we can sustain ourselves, where we're not dipping into the pot enough, where we're getting ourselves in a position where we're going to have to borrow money and have to pay that interest to further complicate our budget situation. So I want to preface this before we get into the interactive part of this even more. The 26 that you're about to see, every single slide that's going to come up is absolute, entirely 100% human nature. The minute that you see a slide in your head, you're going to see a face. It's almanac. We know people. We know who are in these positions. And I urge you to please try and separate a face from what you see on the slide when you're voting. I know it's difficult when you see these different positions. There's also a lot of complicated things when it comes to bumping rights, what positions people can have, et cetera, et cetera. So just because you see a slide and in your head you associate a name with it and say, oh my God, that person's wonderful, I don't want them to leave, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be that person. It could, but I urge you to try and separate the emotional part of that when you're looking at what you think is best for students. And I also want to kind of caveat this, that a lot of these will have approximated figures to them. And I've taken a little bit of heat in some of the presentations where I'll put a range, and the range is $100,000. And people say, how in the world can you make a decision with a range of $100,000? Well, I'll explain when we get to some of these certain slides that it's very hard to guess on what the actual impact is going to be, especially when we get to a couple of the slides that are talking about closing schools. If you do close certain schools, you have to anticipate that there may be a loss of students that are going to neighboring districts as well too. So I'll explain why the figures are the range that they are, and try and give you a specific reason why it is what it is. And so the structure of this presentation will go as such. I'll put up a number for you up here, and this will say survey number 1. And this is locking you out of voting right now because I want to have the ability to be able to explain this to you before you start clicking the button real quick. Okay? So I'll put the idea up. I'll talk about the pros and cons of it. And after we talk about the pros and cons and give you an opportunity to ask questions, then I'll click another button and it'll open up polling for you. And the polling will give you 5 options. You'll click your button, and you can click it 1,000 times. It's only going to register at one time. I'll click another button after that. It'll instantly show the results that we have. And again, those results will be aggregated with all of the other presentations that I've done as well too. Okay? So I'll also preface this. The pros on these, I'm not going to sit here and I'm not going to argue for you on why all of these are great for Algonac Community Schools. I wish we didn't have to put any of these up here. The pros on these are simply this, fiscal. It's going to help save money, which can then further help us avoid all the situations we talked there. So a lot of the talk is going to be on what the impact will be, and we can ask realistic questions about that as well too. So We'll start with implementing every other day cleaning and what that means. Right now, every single one of our buildings gets cleaned by a crew each and every single night. Every single building has a different varying degree of custodians that are in that building, and it ranges based on the size of the building and also ranges in the number of events that are in that building. The two highest used buildings in the